So we'll start out here by talking a little bit about applications. Some people are very frustrated and they find frequently that I'm providing all this information in a resume, and yet when I go to the application, here I'm being asked to repeat all this information. Why are we being asked to do both? Well, the answer more or less would be if we need to distinguish between these two documents. One of these is an effective marketing document created by you, whose intention is to let the employer know about yourself. The other one is a formal statement created by the employer. And so even though these look like they're the same thing, maybe from one point of view, from another, they do serve two different purposes. So they are not trying to torment you. They are, we do have to do this in these two separate things. So some things to keep track of when you're doing these applications. The first thing I would point out is you do have to keep good records when you're doing this, because when you're applying to these different jobs, you'll be going to different websites. When you're going to all these different websites, there's going to be different passwords and different usernames for all these, so it'll be very good to keep track of these things. So you'll definitely want to make sure that you're logging those passwords and usernames so you don't have to keep resetting those when you're trying to apply for jobs. So remember that this application that you're filling out, this is going to be the first contact with the employer, so it is important to leave a good impression here when you're filling out this application. Some of the things that can trip people up when they're filling out applications. It is very important that you follow all the instructions carefully in the application. There will be some kinds of things that can trip people up are like formatting choices, making sure that everything in the application is filled out completely. So if you're getting down to the end and you're not seeing and the button is still grayed out to submit, odds are pretty good that you've left out a critical piece of information somewhere up above, or you have misformatted a piece of information, something like that. So just make sure to try to read through the applications very carefully, try to understand the instructions that you're being given, make sure that you're keeping track of your passwords, usernames, and that sort of thing, and keeping track of who you're applying to. And I think those are the important things to keep track of here. So our main topic for the day is resumes proper. So our goal in the course of this workshop today is to make sure that we understand what the resume basics are, what the basic sections of a resume are, that we understand the importance of targeting our resumes, and that we understand what the formatting choices are and what the best one for our particular situation is going to be. We'll also talk a little bit about accomplishment statements and how that relates to the resume. And finally, we will finish with some brief comments about cover letters. So before I go too far here, I always like to start off by beginning by pointing out that these are matters of opinion. There is no perfect resume. A resume for one position might be different than the same position in a different company, because the different company might be emphasizing one thing or emphasizing another thing. So there really isn't a right answer to these questions. There are many different opinions. Here at the Career Force, our goal is to try to give you different strategies and try to provide you with what seem to be the best practices at the moment in the industry. In the end, the important thing is that you are comfortable with your resume, because you are the person who needs to sell it. So the more comfortable you are with it, the better you are going to be when you're presenting that to the employer, and it'll just make the whole process go better. So what is a resume? What are the essential, most important things about a resume? A resume is in effect a review of your qualifications. It should be confined only to the most essential information. Remember that nobody wants to read more than they have to. It should be skills-based, meaning it should focus on the concrete skills that you have to offer to the employer. Your resume should be unique. It should somehow differentiate you from other people in the marketplace. That is a fair comment. This is indeed an entry-level resume workshop. That is the purpose, is to cover the basics of the resume. Remember that the resume is ultimately marketing a product, and that product is you. The resume must be effective in order for you to get noticed, and we will talk about what that means here. In effect, that means that the resume needs to be targeted to the specific job. And that's what we have for the final here. If it is not targeted to the specific job, odds are pretty good that the human resources departments will not take particular notice of your resume, and you will be overlooked. So what we say in the industry is the resume gets you the interview gets you the job. Remember that the resume does not have to be a complete biography of everything you've ever done. The purpose of the resume is to attract the employer's attention. And so what it needs to do is have enough information in there to intrigue them about you. Ideally, when they're done reading their resume, they should say, this is somebody who we should really talk to because I can see that they have the skills that we're looking for. So you don't have to give them everything. You just have to give them enough that they know that you are potentially a good candidate for the position. It should be quick and easy to read. And it should be attractive to look at. So if you take a look at the screen here, what you're looking at is what's called a heat map. And what this is tracking a reader's eyeballs as they move over the text of a resume. So obviously where you can see the red, that means that they've spent the most time in that section. And then as it fades off into yellow and blue, they've spent less time in those sections. So if you take a look at this image here, what you'll see is that, at least what I see, if you take a look on the left, you'll notice that that giant block of print at the bottom of that resume hasn't even been glanced at by our reviewer. If you take a look at the one on the right, you can see that the resume on the right has taken some effort to include some dividing out the space more, so it's a little bit easier for somebody to read, and you can see that reflected in this heat map. On the one on the left, the reviewer actually did look over much of the resume, as opposed to the one on the left, where those big blocks of text clearly scared this particular reviewer away. So we do want to be aware of the visual impact of a resume. It is important that the resume be pleasant to look at and be readable. These are important parts of the resume. So many times, most of the time, you're going to be uploading these resumes into an online job application, and that means that the company on the other end is going to be, in most cases, using a computer for the initial reading of the resumes. And so we want to make sure that the resume is scannable, meaning that it is able to be read by the computer. In general, these systems are referred to as applicant tracking systems. That is to say, the computers that look at the resumes. And so these computers do have some, how should we say it, known issues with reading the text that they're given. So in general, the simpler the text that it's given and the more it conforms to a standard resume layout, the easier it is going to be for the computer to read the resume properly. And so that's why we see here where it says avoid italics, underlines, borders, lines across the page, etc. All of these sorts of fancier formatting choices, while they do make it look good for a human reader, they can make it more difficult for the computer to properly interpret the text that it's receiving. And so, in general, I think it's best to stick with very simple formatting and try to be as standard as possible so that the computer has the best chance of reading it. You can, if you're looking at a particular company's page, in some cases, You'll be able to determine what the applicant tracking system they're using is, in which case you might be able to Google tips for that particular applicant tracking system. But just in general, be aware that a lot of companies are using these applicant tracking systems, and that means they need to be able, the computer needs to be able to properly interpret your resume. And basically that means that the simpler the resume, the easier it's going to be for the computer to interpret it correctly. So, looks like we have some questions here. Art?
Yeah, Ben, I just wanted to jump on this question right away because it's relevant to what you just talked about. This is a common question we get. Someone had asked, I heard that applicant tracking systems, or ATS, don't read PDF files well. Is this correct?
Well, unfortunately, we have to deal to some extent with rumor here. As I understand it, what I've been told is that the Word document has more formatting information in it. And so in theory, it's easier for the computer to read documents in Word because it has more of that kind of background information in it. So I have heard that about PDFs, that they have a little bit more trouble with PDFs because of that. But in general, I found that if you're aware of the sorts of errors that these things can make, a PDF generally has been okay in my experience.
Yeah, I would echo that, in the past that might have been an issue. Today, almost any modern tracking system will read them both equally well, with one caveat. If you take a picture of basically, if you scan your resume, you have a piece of paper, your resume is printed off, and you scan it as a PDF, make sure that it what calls digitizes your text. If it just takes a picture of it, then it's like a picture of a dog, basically, to the applicant tracking system, and it won't pick up on anything. So make sure you can select text. That's how you know that it's digitized or the characters are recognized. Other than that, any modern system will be able to read both Word and PDFs. One thing to keep in mind, some companies require you to have one or the other. So again, paying attention to the instructions in the application on their preferred ways. There's benefits and detractions for each one of those formats, but in most cases, they will both work equally as well. Thanks, Ben.
My pleasure. So, resumes are in effect a marketing tool. In order for them to be effective, they must be honest and positive. This is important. If you lie in your resume, odds are pretty good that it will sooner or later be figured out. So generally, I think it's key to not do that. Honest and positive is essential. Focus on skills and the things that you have achieved or accomplished rather than simply listing out your task performances. It used to be that when we made resumes, we effectively made what amounted to an extended job description. But these days, employers are more interested in what was the results of your work, what were the achievements of your work. And so to the extent that we can quantify those, that will strengthen our resumes. Remember that the applicant tracking systems basically work by looking for keyword matches between the position description and the resume. So when we're looking at our position descriptions, we want to try to be very careful to identify as many of what we would think of as the keywords in that position description as possible. And where it is plausible, we want to try to include those in our resumes. So this is part of what we mean by targeted to each position. Remember that the resume is a document of choice. You can choose to put in the resume as much or as little as you want. So down here reads overqualified, then it is not targeted. Remember, you do not necessarily need to include everything in the resume. So you do have a lot of choice there. It is true that you will want to have continuity of employment and things like that showing, so leaving out jobs can be a little bit tricky. But do remember that you ultimately are the person who decides what goes into that resume. As long as the information in there is accurate and not dishonest, you should be fine. So there are several different format choices available for resumes, and we will talk about those in a little bit. For the most part, a standard resume is a chronological resume with an emphasis on listing your work experience in reverse chronological order. We will cover the other format types in just a little bit here. So if you think about somebody who's in a hurry and they're looking at your resume, what's the part of the resume that they're going to actually spend time? They're in a hurry, the thing that they're actually going to most likely look at is going to be the top third of your resume. Somebody's in a hurry and they're scanning over it, that's what they're going to look at. So this is the part that we want to spend the most time on, and we want to make sure that that section in particular is full of the information that the employer needs to see. Whatever information the employer most needs to see, if it's critical of the job, it probably needs to be in the top third of the resume. As we can see from that heat image, it is important to include white space in the resume. If the resume is a solid, dense wall of text, employers don't want to look at that, and it's easy for them to ignore your resume. It says here, error-free, edit, 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 and I think this is absolutely true. Even a single grammatical error or a single spelling error could conceivably cause a resume to be discarded that otherwise might have been looked at. So when you have completed your resume, it is absolutely essential that you edit the resume, and it is essential that I would advise that you find another human being to look at the resume as well. You will definitely want a second opinion on the resume. Remember that that top third needs to grab the employer's attention. So here, a well-crafted summary statement can be a big help. Generally, we want to stick to a font size of about 11 to 12. Generally, 10 starts to get a little bit too small, in my opinion, and 14 is just too big. One of the common things that I see is that references available upon request at the bottom of a resume. At this day and time, I think that that's essentially wasted space on the resume. I would not bother with the references upon request at the bottom. Instead, have the references on a separate sheet, label it references, rather than including that in the resume. So, what are the possible choices for formatting the resume? Basically, there's two essential choices for formatting a resume. There's the chronological resume. This is organized by your job history, and this will be essentially a listing of your work experience in reverse chronological order. The primary alternative is called a functional resume, sometimes called a skills-based resume. And it is distinguished from the chronological resume in that rather than being organized by the job history, it is instead organized by skill sets. Obviously, you can combine these two techniques, in which case we'd refer to this as a combination resume. Generally speaking, I tend to recommend the chronological resume for people who are seeking work in the same field in which they've previously had experience. Generally speaking, your previous experience is going to be what gets you the job. So for most people, if they're going for the same type of jobs as they've gone in the past, a chronological resume will be the way to go. There are, however, sometimes when we are not going back into the same career, or we've had a long break in our work experience, or we're new to the workplace, or whatever the situation might be. In some of these cases, we might be better off going with a functional skills-based resume, which will focus on what we can do as opposed to our work experience, because we are assuming that is our skills rather than our experience, which would be getting us the job in these cases. So we'll show these momentarily here. Here we see a standard chronological resume. As you can see here, we start off with the contact and basics at the top. There is a summary statement, which briefly should show what it is that you offer to the employer. Think of this as a 2 to 3 sentence introduction to yourself. And this is probably the single most important section in the resume is what you put right here. So sometimes we can put a key skills or the most important certifications or that kind of thing, and we could list that at the top before we get to the work experience. That would be what I would consider to be an optional field. And then as you can see, the rest of the main body of the resume is taken up by a description of your work experience in reverse chronological order. A few things to point out here. We do want to have, as much as possible, a continuous job history. So ideally, we want to have no gaps in that chronological presentation there. What else here? That's what I was going to say. So when we're doing these sections here too, another thing that I often see people making mistakes on is, in my view, the thing that you want to bold and put first is going to be your title. So generally I go title and then the times worked and then the employer, and I also include the employer location. So for me, I would have employer and employer location on the second line here. And the reason why I say that is that your title ultimately is more important than the company who you worked at. The title is what they need to see. So I do see it fairly commonly where people will put the business name first. I generally regard that as an error. Remember to use a professional email address at the top. We don't want to use a personal email address with a funny or quirky name. We definitely want a professional sounding email here. I just did see that comment there. Do you need to put in an address? So in my opinion, it's generally best to put in a city and state. I do not like to put in the full physical address. In most cases, you will provide that on the job application and you don't need to provide it in the resume. If they're going to reach out to you, they're most likely going to reach out to you by phone or by email. And so you do want to have the phone and the email in there. I personally like to include the city and state because it lets them know you're local, but I do not necessarily include the street address. So here we're seeing the functional style of resume, and you see it looks similarly to the last one. We have the contact section at the top. We have the summary statement coming up next. Here it's listed as an objective. I generally prefer a summary statement because I think an objective tends to be more what you want, whereas a summary statement, when you write it that way, tends to be more focused on what the employer is looking for. If you have a LinkedIn account or if you have a portfolio or some such thing, you can also include that in this top section. I don't generally recommend including the LinkedIn unless you actually use the LinkedIn and are there all the time. So if you are a regular user of LinkedIn and you're there on a daily basis and you're updating your page and you're paying attention, then it is an excellent idea to put LinkedIn at the top. If, however, you have a LinkedIn page that you only look at once a month, I don't think it's worth it putting in there. There's a chance that they would reach out to you on that page. You would not be there to get that contact. So in those cases, I don't necessarily recommend it. So if we take a look here, looks like we have a question. Art?
Just real quick, because this is too long to type. I'm trying to answer the questions in the chat the best I can. Someone had a question about the best way to list multiple positions held with the same employer. Any thoughts on that, Ben?
Well, there's two basic approaches you can do there, and I've seen both. One is you can have a giant heading for the company, and then you can list all the other positions that you've had underneath that and show with the formatting that that's what happened. Or you can list them all out as separate individual jobs. In my opinion, I guess, and you might have a different opinion here, Art, I think in general, I think the second option is a little bit better where you list them all out, because when you're doing the indentation to try to show the relations, I think that can be a little bit hard for the computers to read, and it can also make the resume a little bit confusing for a human reader as well. But there can be different opinions on that. Art, do you have an opinion?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. The only thing I would add to that is based on what you're trying to show an employer, you decide which one. So if you want to show longevity, you might do that big heading that shows the full length of time you've worked for that company. Because what'll happen is if you worked with a company, I worked with companies where I've had 3 jobs within a year span of time. And if I list those out each separately and it looks like they're separate positions, it looks like I'm jumping around. But what I could do is I could say I worked for this company for 5 years, and in that time period, I've had 3 jobs. So it just depends. And this is a perfect example of reaching out to your local career force location to get the input from someone in your area to review your resume. We do provide resume reviews. We are, in most cases, currently closed to the public. We do have some opportunities for in-person, but we can do this online over the phone also. So I'll be sending everyone information on how to reach out to your local career force location to set up an appointment that works for you, whether that be in person, online, or over the phone. And I highly encourage you to bring up issues like that and what you want out of it. You know, here's what I'm trying to show an employer. What's the best way to format my resume to do that? Everyone's situation's a little bit different, so it's really good to have that one-on-one conversation. Thanks, man.
It's my pleasure. Just to pick up a little bit on what Art said there, you can either call a career force location and request that resume review, or if you are registered at minnesotaworks.net, you can go into careerforcemn.com, look for a one-on-one individual assistance session, and you may sign up for a resume review in that fashion as well. So to return to this functional resume layout. So as I was indicating, the top is going to be pretty similar to the chronological resume, but here we're going to see quite a bit of difference. You'll notice that rather than listing out our work experience here, instead, we are going to pick skill sets and how we have those particular sets of skills, what our experience of those skills is. And you'll notice here that oh dear, let's go back here. And you'll notice that sorry, I'm not super good at this. You can see down at the bottom, I believe you can see this. The professional volunteer experience is sort of de-emphasized here down at the very bottom. If you see that on this, I don't see it on the slide, but I believe you can see it here is a little bit better.
Yeah, you can see it, Ben.
Okay, good. So in this functional resume, well, here we are showing a combination resume. Let me go back to this functional resume. In the functional resume, the thing to be aware of is that this format is not going to match the format of a job application. And so if you choose to do a functional style resume, while this will look good to human readers, it can cause problems for the computer. The computer is going to be looking for fields like, it's going to be expecting to see the chronological resume fields there, and it's not going to have a separate field set aside for, say, customer service skills, financial administration skills, project management skills. So what this means is that if the computer does not know what to do with that text, it's going to end up possibly putting it in the wrong place, if not even likely putting it in the wrong place. So if we do choose to go with a functional style resume, it will be critical that we examine the document after we have uploaded it and see exactly what the computer did with it. It may be that we will have to do some extensive post-upload editing of the document for it to make sense. So The functional resume, I think, does a great job when we're changing careers of showing how we're qualified for this new job, but it does present some challenges in terms of the practicalities of uploading the resume in many cases. So here we see a combination resume. I do see that question there. How far back did you go with chronological resume? In general, I think a couple guidelines are that employers are looking for approximately 10 to 15 years of job history to demonstrate continuity of employment. So if you can show 10 to 15 years, that's probably going to be good enough. Going back longer than 15 years, you start to age yourself to an extent. And you also have to ask yourself, how relevant are job skills that I have acquired 20 years ago? You know, if you used Quicken back in the year 2000, but you haven't touched it since, you're not going to be up to date. You're probably not going to get a lot of credit for that kind of experience. So to answer that question in general, I think about 10 to 15 years is necessary to show continuity of employment, if you can do that. And as a general rule for length, I recommend approximately 1 page for every 10 years. So with the combination resume, as you can see here, we're just basically blending the two styles. I don't think I need to spend too much time. So we'll go a little bit more into the individual sections of the resume here. We're going to start off with the header here. As you can see, we are not including the street address here. We are, of course, including the name, city and state, a phone number, and email, and as I indicated earlier, LinkedIn if we are using it and that is appropriate. Next up is this summary section. So this has generally been referred to in the past. I think this is usually called the objective. These days, I think the emphasis is more on a summary statement. An objective statement says what you want. I'm looking for a position that offers, etc. Whereas the summary statement says, this is what I have to offer to you. So generally, I do recommend that we make a summary statement at the top of the resume. This being in the top third of the resume, this is probably the single most important statement in the resume, in my humble opinion. Generally, I prefer to start with the title, follow this up by years of experience, and follow this up by identifying what I regard as key skills, experiences, accomplishments, achievements, etc. So in a chronological resume, what we're basically going to be doing is we're going to be listing out our experience in reverse chronological order. As you can see here, we have the title first, then the dates on the right, and then the company name down below that. We want to include the city and state for the company because if our employer wants to look up that company, we want to make it easy for them to get that information. So next up, we got the qualifications themselves. So there's a lot of different ways that we can come up with what we need to put in here for our qualifications, and we list out the individual things that we did. My general advice is to look at the position descriptions very carefully and try to understand what it is about your experience that they need to know. So ideally, these qualifications are listed and chosen after a careful examination of the position description. If you're looking for inspiration for these things, you can look at position descriptions online if you can find your actual job description. If they've reposted your position, you can look at that position to see what kinds of things are in there. There are online resources like ONET Online that can give you very detailed job descriptions that include very extensive task descriptions for different careers. So that can be pretty helpful. The education section generally goes at the bottom of the resume, and generally we only need to list our highest level of educational achievement. So if we have a bachelor's degree and we also have a high school diploma, we do not need to list a high school diploma because the bachelor's degree supersedes. Sometimes people ask, should I include the dates on my resume? Generally speaking, my advice is to not include the dates unless you are a very recent graduate. So it is perfectly okay to leave the dates off your educational entries. It is also, you don't necessarily need to list all of your education either. Just make sure that the education listed is accurate. So some other sections that we might choose to include in the resume would include any of the sections that you see right here. All of these are potentially candidates for inclusion in a resume. Military experience can be set in, volunteer, etc. You may wish to be aware that some affiliations could be polarizing. So political and religious affiliations, you might not wish to include in the resume depending on the circumstances. But in general, any of the things that you see here on this list, all can be included in a resume. I would probably be inclined to include any of these if I happen to have them. Accomplishment statements. So when we list out our task descriptions for the different jobs, I think there's a tendency to list them out as just, these are the tasks that I performed on the job. You're doing, in effect, an extended job description. But these days, the emphasis is really more on what were the results of that work? What was the outcome of the work? So whenever we can show that kind of information, that makes it more compelling to the employer. So we are now going to do a little exercise here. I'm going to show you a slide, and then we're going to have you rewrite these into accomplishment statements and have you type those into the chat window. So here we go. Here's a couple of task descriptions. Kept inventory and called customers. So how can we rewrite these into more of an accomplishment statement? So we want to try to think, is there a way to quantify our work? Is there a way to put numbers on what we've done? That kind of thing. So let's just take a few seconds here and see if we can come up with a more compelling and interesting way to make an accomplishment statement out of these two statements here. I'll give you about a minute here, and then I'll have Art read some of these off.
Okay, as we're getting some more in, I'm just going to read a couple of them. Managed inventory levels to ensure all products were available upon customer requirements. Customer satisfaction specialist. Managed customer base with frequent contact. Inventory control specialist, inventory management or logistics. Some additional ways of saying something very simple with saying something a little more impactful.
All right.
Here's another one. Managed a certain amount of inventory related to blank, recorded supplies in a timely manner. We'll do two more, and then Ben, I'll have you give our ideas. Built relationships with customer base through continued contact. Took inventory each month that decreased bookkeeping errors by 90%. And then one last one. Customer-facing phone contact averaged 20 to 30, I imagine, calls each day. All forms of contact. Sorry, it's kind of all forms of contact totaled thousands per year as an operational engineer. Okay, Ben, what are your ideas on some ways to do that?
Well, we'll show our suggestions in a second here, but it sounds to me like people are definitely getting the idea here. Here's our suggestions here for kept inventory. We have managed daily inventory of over 1,000 classifications of medical supplies. Called customers, we recommend grew client base from 0 to 70 within 2 months by effectively using cold call techniques. So again, anywhere where we can put in numbers, anywhere where we can quantify that impact, I think that adds to the weight of the resume. So, but from what I heard there, it sounds like people have a pretty good sense of that. So that's pretty good news. Cover letters. Is generally recommended to include a cover letter with your resume. In particular, if you are, if this is a cold resume, in other words, a resume they are not expecting to receive. It is true that in some cases your cover letter will not be read or it will be disregarded. But there are other times when it won't be, and we want to take advantage of those times when it won't be. Generally, with the cover letter, I recommend going with a pretty simple 3-paragraph format. I generally go with a introductory statement. Hi, my name is Ben Andrews. I'm interested in the welding position you posted on Indeed.com. So first paragraph, where I learned about the contact, what the position I'm interested in. In the second paragraph, I tend to briefly state why I think I'm a good fit for this job. As you can see, I have the MIG and TIG welding skills that you are looking for. And in the third paragraph, we indicate how we intend to follow up on the contact. So I look forward to discussing my qualifications with you. If I do not hear back from you within 2 weeks, I'll email you at this address to determine the status of my candidacy, something like that. So the cover letter can also be used if you have, if you know somebody at the company, if you have, so an internal contact of the company, that'd be a good place to mention it. If you are looking at changing careers from one career to another, you can use this middle paragraph here in your cover letter to explain your circumstances. Now, even though I don't have the experience you're necessarily expecting to see, I think that these experiences that I have make me an excellent candidate for the job. So, so I do think that including the cover letter is, at the worst that it can be, is a little bit of a waste of your time if they choose to not read it. But if they do choose to read it, it can be another opportunity to plug your skills. I'll just say one last thing here and then I'll talk to Art. And that is that we don't want to repeat information in the cover letter that is included in the resume. The cover letter should really be a complement to the cover letter, to the resume, as opposed to a restatement of what's already in there. Art?
Yeah, I want to just acknowledge this one question here, because we get this quite a bit. When you hear other people's examples, and then you think, well, I can't use those examples. And you're absolutely right, you can't. The question is, in the skill statements or things we do in our cover letter, isn't this kind of exaggerating? What if we do not have the statistics from our employer, are unaware or simply didn't accomplish great results because of internal structures within the company? Putting numbers or making up statistics seem fake. I want to just very much clarify, we never make up statistics. It's just that most people, if you talk to someone like Ben or a local career force representative, things that seem common every day to you are things that can be quantified. You don't see as much value because you did it every day. I was a CNA for 9 years, so I took care of Alzheimer's patients. And it would be like, that's just what I did. If I talked to someone about that, they could say, oh, here's some great marketing points that you cared for end of life, you did hospice care, you did medication administration, you took care of the activities and daily living for up to 9 people per day. You start getting numbers that you can market. We're never saying make up numbers. That is not anything we would ever recommend anyone do, because that's going to come back and bite you. But when you talk to someone about the things you've done in your work history, we can help you develop those realistic and truthful numbers that you can use to quantify what you've done in the past. Anything you would add to that, Ben?
I definitely think it's true that, you know, people who are in sales or on management, depending on the job, they might have access to a lot more numbers than other workers might. So I understand that there are people who don't. I understand that we're not always in a position to have solid numbers on quantifying our work. I guess I'm just trying to say that when we do have the opportunity to try to show what the outcome and results of our work are, I do think that that is more impressive to the employer than simply describing the task that we've performed on the job. So, so back to the cover letters here. Like I say, I do think that it's possible that the cover letter will be disregarded, but in those cases where it's not disregarded, I do think it is essential that we provide that cover letter. It can give additional context to our resume. So I definitely recommend it. So like I say, you want to state the job that you're applying for, indicate why you're interested. You want to suggest, without repeating what's in the resume itself, how you think you're a good fit for the job. You'll want to be sure to thank them for the opportunity to discuss your qualifications. And as I said, I generally finish with a, this is how I intend to follow up. So, like I say, if you are interested in getting resume reviews from the Career Force, you can reach out to your Career Force location. You can reach out by phone. It says email your resume or cover letter to be reviewed by Career Force staff. That is acceptable as well. You can also sign up for a one-on-one individual assistance session on careerforcemn.com. So at this point, I think I will throw this open to any other general questions here.
Sorry, Ben, I was trying to get the Career Force locator. I'm going to copy and paste the Career Force locator page into the chat box. So if you aren't aware or you're new to the Career Force system, there are 50 Career Force locations throughout the state of Minnesota. Many have appointments open right now. So you can just put in your town or your zip code into what I'm going to paste in here. And this will be included in the follow-up information that I send everybody tomorrow. And you can find your nearest location. And if they have available appointments, you can register for one. Just like you registered for today's class, you can register for an appointment. So Ben, there is a question I wanted to get to, and we get this quite a bit, where someone hears something different from a particular recruiter or a particular person at a particular company. And it speaks to a little bit towards specific knowledge. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, but what I always say is if you are marketing yourself to a company in which you have an inside track, in which maybe you've done an informational interview, and they say, hey, you know, we don't like resumes that way. Here's how we like them. I always say specific knowledge of the needs of an employer trumps anything Ben or I or anyone else will say. And I think Ben did a really good job to say there are opinions on resume. It's what works is the rule you go by. So Ben has probably 50 different employers he has knowledge of in his area. I have that same thing in my area. And that's why, again, it's really important to reach out. Ben, what do you say when someone will come and say, well, I heard from someone else that you don't do it this way?
I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question. This is in regard to how to make a resume, how to write up the resume.
Yep.
The fact of the matter is that there really is not a right answer to, there is no perfect resume. Every resume is going to be different depending on the position, depending on the company. There are different yeah, I'm not sure I'm saying this very well. I think the best you can do is try to understand what it is that the company is looking for and write the resume to that. I think sometimes when we write resumes, we sort of write the resume to this abstract space in our head. But the fact is that nobody reads a resume for its own sake. The only time resumes are being read is pretty much they're being read by human resources people who are trying to determine whether or not the person they're looking at is a candidate for the position they're looking at. So that is how we always want to be writing those resumes. We want to be as much as possible laser focused on understanding what it is that the employer is looking for and trying to answer that. Since there really are no, since we're not the employer, we don't really know exactly what they want for. It's hard for us to write the perfect resume for. But yeah, I guess that's
exactly.
my answer on that.
So I got a bunch of questions coming in. I'll get to as many as I can. Let's see here. So there was two questions that kind of mirror each other. How do you handle it when your job tenures are generally shorter periods, 2 to 4 years? People change jobs every 3 to 5 years, so that's not out of bounds. But if you have many jobs in the last, 15 years, maybe you only go back 10 years to show those 5 jobs. What do you think about shorter term employment and when it becomes an issue, Ben? When does that become an issue on a resume?
Well, my impression is about the same as yours here. About 3 to 5 years would be pretty typical. So if you're changing jobs every couple of years, I think that's probably within the bounds. I think it's also true these days that there is more tolerance for job changes just because of the nature of the market. We've had a lot of job disruption over the last couple of years. Lots of people are finding themselves out of work. So a lot more people are having interruptions in their resumes and that sort of thing. So I do think there's more tolerance for that. But I do agree, if you have a very large number of jobs in a relatively short period of time, that does not look great to employers. Your options are not great. You could choose not to include them all, but then you're going to have gaps in your employment history. Yeah.
Yeah, 2 to 4 is not an issue in my mind. The other side the flip side of that is, and I'm just going to give you some quick thoughts on it. On the flip side of that question, a job tenure of 28 years in the last position, and especially in a chronological resume, it becomes, in a good way, hard to format that because you've got one job and you don't want to put 28 bullets under one job. We usually recommend no more than 5 to maybe up towards of 7 bullets for a job. So I always say, look at, did you have different job titles during that time? Did the company change hands? Is there any way you can truthfully break up that employment to both show longevity and possibly advancement? That becomes tricky, but it's a good thing. It means you've got longevity at a job, but you have to kind of deal with formatting issues. And again, broken record here, reach out to your local career force location to do that. Ben, any other thoughts on long-term employment, very long-term employment?
Well, to continue on the one before just a little bit, you could choose to do a functional resume in a case like that. By doing a functional resume, you're going to be putting the emphasis on your skills and putting those front and center. And if you'll remember from that format, the job history is only at the bottom. So if you have a large number of jobs in a single period of time, maybe in this case right here, we go with a functional resume instead of a chronological resume to switch the emphasis from our work experience to the actual core skills. In terms of a long singular employment at a single company, so if you've been working at 3M for 30 years, I think you can certainly do what Art has just suggested here, would be you can list out the various titles in order to break up the entry more. I don't know that I have any suggestions beyond that, though, off the top of my
head. Another question someone had is, could you address, if you have a specific need, could you, let me see if I can get the exact term here. When setting up a one-on-one help for your resume, can you request a specific career force person to help you go through it? For instance, I'm an ex-teacher and would love to have a coach with teaching experience help me transfer my soft skills. So we have many career force specialists with a wide variety of experience. And when what happens is you call in, or you register. Once you register for an appointment, we're going to give you a call. and say, how would you like to meet? Would you like to meet over the phone, in person, or online? At that point, you can ask and say, hey, I'm a teacher. Do you have anyone who has that background? And we can connect you with someone who is going to be able to give you that kind of best experience. They're going to have that information. They're going to be able to answer those questions better for you. So that would be an awesome opportunity to get the most out of your appointment by asking for some specific experience. And then I'll give you this one, Ben. Could you address if you don't hear back from an employer or just get a computer-generated response to your application? I have wanted to follow up, but worry about coming off as a pest or impatient with folks who have a busy schedule and power over my candidacy, basically, not wanting to irritate them. What's your feelings about following up?
Well, I don't actually get a whole lot of feedback from HR people, so I'm just going here by pure instinct. And my sense is that I would, after submitting an application, want to give them probably something on the order of 2 weeks to respond to that application. So if they don't get back to you within a couple of weeks, I think it's okay at that point to reach out and see what's going on with the application. I would not want to make multiple attempts to do that. I would make one and hope that they respond to it. I do think that it is possible to come across to the HR people as a pest if you're constantly bothering them. So I do think that is a legitimate concern. So I guess that's my general advice would be I would wait up to 2 weeks and I would make one attempt to get a hold of them. And if they don't choose to respond to that, I would personally probably let it go at that point. Do you agree, Art?
Some companies are, yeah. Some companies are very open to that. Some companies expect it. Some are not open to it. But like Ben said, making that one attempt will give you an idea. If they're open to further, a follow-up, you're gonna kind of get that. I know it's uncomfortable to make that call. However, I would make that one attempt at least in a week to 2 weeks. We're at time. Thank you everyone for all the great questions. I'll take a look through the chat and see if there's any we didn't get to. I'll turn it over to Ben to wrap it up today.
Well, I want to thank everybody for sticking with us to the end here. I hope you got something out of that presentation. We do have the other ones coming up here. I encourage you to take advantage of any of those that you think might be worth your time. If you of course know the name of any particular rep, you are welcome to reach out to them. Otherwise, you can simply contact the Career Force location of your choice, and they should be able to find somebody to get a resume review for you. We like to do them, so don't hesitate to reach out and ask for those reviews. It is one of our main tasks here, so take advantage of it. So I thank you very much for paying attention here. As Art indicated, we will be sending out this material over the next day or so. And I thank you for your time and attention, and I wish you the best of luck on your job hunt.